All right, so today we're diving deep into cybersecurity. More specifically, a company called Rhyno Cybersecurity. You give us a whole bunch of stuff from their website, marketing materials, technical details, even some customer reviews. So I guess our mission here is to figure out what Rhyno's all about. And more importantly, I guess, why should anyone listening actually care?
Yeah, it's a jungle out there in the cybersecurity world. Lots of companies making big promises. But we'll sift through it all and see if Rhyno can actually deliver.
Okay, sounds good. So first things first, I went through their About Us page, and, well, it's kind of what you'd expect. They talk about being a trusted partner for businesses, but they also keep mentioning this cybersecurity awareness training. That seems a little different, right? Most companies just focus on the tech side of things.
Yeah, that's a good point. It could be a good sign that they're thinking about the human element. Because let's be honest, people are often the weakest link in the security chain. So focusing on training could be a smart move, especially if you've got a lot of employees who maybe aren't that tech savvy.
Right, especially with everyone working remotely these days. Speaking of tech, let's talk about their main product, this RhynoGUARD MDR thing. It's clearly their flagship, but I'm not entirely sure what MDR even means in practice.
MDR stands for Managed Detection and Response. It's like having a dedicated security team working around the clock to protect your network. They're actively looking for threats, responding to incidents, basically your own personal cybersecurity SWAT team.
Okay, that sounds pretty awesome. But why would I choose that over just hiring my own security team?
That's the thing. Not every company can afford to build out a whole security operations center. It's expensive, it's complex. Rhyno's targeting those businesses that need that high level of security but don't have the resources to do it themselves.
So it's like outsourcing your security to the experts.
Exactly.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
So what makes RhynoGUARD so special? What are they doing that others aren't?
Well, they talk a lot about being prevention-centric, which is interesting, but also kind of vague, Do they have some secret sauce that lets them predict the future of cyber attacks?
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing.
Well, no crystal ball, unfortunately. But they are emphasizing proactive measures. Things like using threat intelligence to identify potential attacks before they even happen.
So instead of just reacting to attacks, they're trying to stop them before they even start.
Exactly.
Sounds way better than just cleaning up the mess afterwards.
Absolutely. They're also really pushing their AI-driven analytics, which, AI is kind of a buzzword these days, so I'm always a little skeptical.
Same here. Feels like every company is trying to slap an AI-powered sticker on everything.
Right, you gotta be careful with the hype. But AI can actually play a really important role in cybersecurity. In this case, it's about using machine learning to analyze huge amounts of data and spot patterns that might indicate an attack. Think of it like a digital bloodhound sniffing out a trail. They can pick up on things that humans might miss.
Okay, that makes sense. But even if they spot something suspicious, how quickly do they actually respond?
Well, they mention a 20-minute SLA for incident investigation, which is actually pretty impressive in the cybersecurity world. Every second counts when you're dealing with a potential breach. The faster you can identify and contain a threat, the less damage it can do.
So they're constantly watching for threats and aiming to respond quickly. But how does the whole system actually work? They mentioned this 4-step process: data collection, analysis, incident review, and response. Can you break that down for me a bit?
Sure. First, they gather data from your systems: network traffic, user activity logs, security alerts, all that stuff. Then they use what they call behavioral detection engines to analyze that data.
Behavioral detection engines. That sounds a little creepy, like they're spying on my employees.
It might sound like that, but it's actually a pretty common technique. Basically, it's about establishing a baseline of normal activity and then looking for anything that deviates from that pattern.
So if I suddenly start downloading gigabytes of data in the middle of the night, that might raise a red flag.
Exactly. That's where the data analysis comes in. They use AI and machine learning to look for those anomalies.
Got it. So is it all robots from here on out? No humans involved?
Not quite. Rhyno emphasizes that they have a team of security experts who are involved in the next stage, which is incident review.
So humans are still in the loop. That's reassuring.
Yes, and it's really important. AI can be incredibly helpful, but it's not a silver bullet. You still need human expertise to understand the nuances of a situation and make those judgment calls.
So it's a good sign that they're not just relying on algorithms to make all the decisions.
Definitely. And then the final step is response. This is where they actually take action to contain and neutralize the threat. They might isolate infected devices, patch vulnerabilities, or even work with law enforcement, whatever it takes to stop the attack from spreading.
Okay, that all makes sense. So they're monitoring my systems, analyzing data, and responding to threats. But they also talk about this 360-degree visibility thing. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means they're monitoring every corner of your IT environment. Your computers, your network, your cloud services, your mobile devices. They're not just focused on one area. They're looking at the big picture.
Wow, that's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And one of the things they highlight is integration with Microsoft 365, which is a big deal for a lot of businesses these days.
Yeah, but I mean, everyone uses Microsoft Office, right? Why is that so special?
It's more than just Office these days. Microsoft 365 has become the backbone for so many businesses. Email, file sharing, collaboration tools. By integrating with that, Rhyno can see a huge chunk of your data and communications, which is essential for detecting and responding to threats effectively.
So it's like having a security camera pointed right at my most important data.
Exactly.
They also mentioned a bunch of other integrations. It seems like they're trying to work with the tools you already have, instead of forcing you to replace everything.
Exactly. They even give some specific examples of how these integrations work in practice, like monitoring remote connections and flagging questionable downloads.
That's interesting. We've got a lot of people working remotely these days. So yeah, keeping track of who's accessing our network and from where seems pretty important. And we've definitely had a few close calls with people downloading things they shouldn't have. So that questionable downloads feature could be useful.
It sounds like those integrations could be a good fit for you then. But before we go too far down that road, let's see what actual customers are saying about RhynoGUARD. They have a lot of positive reviews on their website, but, we always have to take those with a grain of salt.
Of course. But there was one quote that stood out to me. It was from the head of IT at some finance firm. They said, "Swift incident alerts enhance our ability to gain a clearer picture of network activities and respond promptly." That sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah, it does. And it speaks to one of the key benefits of MDR. It's not just about blocking threats. It's about giving you better visibility into what's happening on your network so you can make informed decisions about your security posture.
So is that the kind of outcome that I could expect if we went with Rhyno?
It's certainly possible, but it's important to remember that every organization is different. The effectiveness of any security solution depends on a lot of factors. What kind of data you have, what your biggest security concerns are, how well you actually implement the solution.
Right, so there's no guarantee.
Unfortunately not.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But there's one more thing I want to dig into before we move on. Rhyno spends a lot of time comparing themselves to other types of security solutions, specifically XDR, EDR, and MSSPs. They clearly see these as their main competition.
Yeah, they do. It's like they're saying, hey, we're not just better than nothing. We're better than the other guys, too.
So can you break down the key differences for me? And is Rhyno right? Are they actually better than the alternatives?
That's where things get really interesting. We're talking about 3 very different approaches to security here. And it's not always easy to compare apples to oranges.
Okay, well, let's try to unpack it. What are we dealing with here?
So to start, we have XDR and EDR. XDR stands for Extended Detection and Response, and EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. Both are really focused on tech to monitor your systems for anything fishy. Think of them like high-tech security cameras and motion sensors, always on the lookout for trouble.
Okay, I get those. They sound like they can catch a lot.
They can, but they can also be a bit too sensitive. Imagine a super sensitive alarm system that goes off every time a squirrel runs across your roof.
I see what you mean. Lots of false alarms.
Exactly. Now, MSSPs are a bit different. They're more like your traditional security guard company.
That acronym was throwing me off.
Yeah.
MSSP, what does that even stand for?
MSSP stands for Managed Security Service Provider. They offer a wider range of services, from managing your firewalls to keeping an eye on your logs. They usually have a team of human analysts to investigate when something happens, so they're more like your boots-on-the-ground security force.
Okay, so we've got the tech-heavy XDR and EDR, and the more human-powered MSSPs. But where does Rhyno's MDR fit into all of this? They seem pretty confident that they're offering something unique.
Well, Rhyno is saying that MDR takes the best of both worlds. It's like having the high-tech security systems and a team of expert analysts all working together.
So it's like having the security cameras and the guards who know what to look for.
Exactly. They're really pushing that proactive approach. Not just waiting for things to go wrong, but actively looking for trouble before it starts. And they're highlighting their expertise and their ability to create custom security solutions.
That all sounds pretty good. But is MDR really the best solution out there? Is it truly better than the alternative?
It's not that simple. Each solution has its strengths and weaknesses. The best choice depends on your specific needs and resources. XDR and EDR can be really good at detecting and responding to threats quickly, but as we talked about, they can also create a lot of false alarms. That can be overwhelming for a small team to handle.
Right. Who has time to chase squirrels all day?
Exactly. And MSSPs can be a good choice for businesses that don't have in-house security expertise, but they might not be as up-to-date on the latest threats or as adaptable to your specific needs.
So there's no single answer, no magic bullet.
Unfortunately not. And we have to remember that Rhyno is trying to sell their MDR service. They're naturally going to focus on the positives.
That's fair. So how do I figure out what's best for my business? It seems like there's so much to consider.
It all starts with understanding your own situation. What kind of data do you have? What are your biggest worries when it comes to security? How much can you spend on cybersecurity? Once you have a clear picture of your needs, you can start comparing different solutions and providers.
That makes sense. It's like figuring out what kind of car to buy. You wouldn't buy a sports car if you need to haul lumber.
Precisely. It's about finding the right tool for the job. But even with the best tools, we can't forget about the human side of things. Technology is important, but it's not the whole story.
That's a good point. It seems like we're putting so much trust in technology these days. But we've seen how easily systems can be hacked if someone exploits human weaknesses.
That's true. And that brings up some really important questions, like how much should we rely on machines to keep us safe? And what are the risks of putting all our eggs in the technology basket?
Those are some big questions. Are there any answers?
Well, that's what we need to figure out.
Yeah.
And I think a good place to start is by looking at the potential downsides of relying too heavily on technology. What are the trade-offs we might be making?
That sounds like a good place to pick up in part 3. I'm ready to dive into those tough questions.
So picking up where we left off, we were talking about the risks of relying too much on technology. And I think one of the biggest dangers is that it can create a false sense of security.
Right.
We start to believe that because we have all these fancy systems in place, we're invincible, but that's simply not true.
Right. It's like thinking you're safe just because you have a burglar alarm. You still need to lock your doors and windows.
Exactly. Technology is just a tool. It can help us, but it can't do everything for us.
So what's the answer? If we can't rely solely on technology, what else can we do?
Well, I think we need to focus more on the human element of cybersecurity. We need to educate people about the risks and empower them to make smart decisions.
Okay, so more training.
Yes, but it's not just about training people on how to use specific software or how to spot phishing emails. It's about helping them develop a security mindset, teaching them to think critically about the information they encounter online, and to be aware of the potential consequences of their actions.
So it's like teaching them to be their own personal security guard.
Exactly.
But that sounds really hard. I mean, people are busy. They don't always have time for security training.
I know it's a challenge, but it's essential. Think of it this way. Would you rather spend a few hours on security training now, or risk losing all your data and facing a major security breach later?
Yeah, that's a good point. Prevention is always better than cure.
Exactly. And the good news is that security training doesn't have to be boring or time-consuming. There are lots of innovative ways to engage people and make it fun.
Like what?
Well, some companies are using gamification to make security training more interactive and engaging. Others are using simulations to help people experience real-world scenarios and learn how to respond effectively.
That sounds a lot more interesting than just reading through a bunch of policies and procedures.
It is, and it's much more likely to stick with people.
Okay, so we need to focus on training and awareness. But what about the ethical implications of all this technology? You mentioned that earlier.
Right, that's another important consideration. As we rely more and more on AI and automation in cybersecurity, we need to make sure that we're not sacrificing our privacy or our values in the process.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. One concern is surveillance. Some of these technologies can be used to track people's movements and activities. We need to make sure that they're not being used to spy on employees or customers.
That's a little scary.
It is, and it's something that we need to be very careful about. Another concern is bias. AI systems are only as good as the data they're trained on. If that data is biased, the system will be biased too.
So if an AI system is trained on data that suggests that certain groups of people are more likely to be security risks, it might unfairly flag those people as suspicious.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to make sure that the data we use to train AI systems is representative and unbiased.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. Technology can be a powerful tool for good, but it can also be misused. It's up to us to ensure that we're using it responsibly and ethically.
Well said. So where do we go from here? What's the next step?
Well, I think the first step is to acknowledge that there's no easy answer. Cybersecurity is a complex issue, and there's no single solution that will work for everyone.
Fair enough.
But I think there are some things we can all do to improve our security posture. First, we need to stay informed about the latest threats and vulnerabilities. Second, we need to be proactive about taking steps to protect ourselves. And third, we need to be willing to adapt and change as the threat landscape evolves.
Those are all good points, but it sounds like a lot of work.
It can be, but it's worth it because the stakes are high. Our data, our privacy, our security, it's all on the line.
You're right. We can't afford to be complacent.
Exactly. We need to be vigilant, and we need to be prepared.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today, and I've definitely learned a lot. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
So what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
That cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. It's not just about technology. It's about people. And it's about making smart choices.
I think that's a great message to end on. Thank you again for joining us. Anytime. We were talking about the human side of cybersecurity. And, one thing that really strikes me is how much we tend to focus on the technology, all the fancy tools and systems. But we often forget about the people who are actually using those tools.
Yeah, it's like buying a state-of-the-art security system for your house, but then leaving the front door wide open.
Exactly. Technology can only do so much if people aren't using it properly, or if they're making bad decisions. Then it's all for nothing.
So how do we address that? How do we make sure that people are using technology effectively and making smart choices?
Well, education is key. People need to understand the risks, and they need to know how to protect themselves.
Some more training.
Yeah, but it's not just about teaching people how to use specific software or how to spot a phishing email. It's about helping them develop a security mindset so they can think critically about the information they encounter online and make good decisions about their own security.
That sounds like a pretty tall order. It can be, but it's essential. Think about it this way. Would you rather spend a few hours on security training now or risk losing all your data and facing a major security breach later?
Yeah, I guess nobody wants to deal with that.
Exactly. And the good news is that security training doesn't have to be boring or tedious. There are lots of creative ways to make it engaging and even fun.
Like what?
Well, some companies are using gamification to make security training more interactive. Others are using simulations to help people experience real-world scenarios and learn how to respond effectively.
That sounds a lot more interesting than just sitting through a PowerPoint presentation.
It is. And it's much more likely to stick with people.
Okay, so we need to invest in education and training. But you also mentioned the ethical implications of all this technology. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. As we rely more and more on AI and automation in cybersecurity, we need to be careful that we're not sacrificing our privacy or our values in the process.
Can you give me some examples?
Well, one concern is surveillance. Some of these technologies can be used to track people's movements and activities, and we need to make sure that they're not being used to spy on employees or customers.
That's a little unsettling.
It can be, and it's something that we need to be very mindful of. Another concern is bias. AI systems are only as good as the data they're trained on. So if that data is biased, the system will be biased too.
So if an AI system is trained on data that suggests certain groups of people are more likely to be security risks, then it might unfairly flag those people as suspicious.
Exactly. And that could lead to all sorts of problems: discrimination, profiling, even false accusations.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. We need to make sure that we're using technology in a way that is responsible, ethical, and that benefits everyone.
Well said. So to wrap up our deep dive into Rhyno cybersecurity, it seems like they offer some promising solutions. But it's important to remember that technology is just one piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. We can't just rely on technology to keep us safe. We need to think about the human element, and we need to use technology in a way that is ethical and responsible.
This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
Me too. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us.
Anytime.
And that's our show for today. Thanks for listening. And remember, stay safe out there in the digital world.